The committee will come to order. We can all agree that funding improvements to the nation's infrastructure is vitally important to creating economic growth and promoting commerce. An important feature of our tax reform discussion draft would provide enough revenue to maintain the solvency of the Highway Trust Fund for 8 years. Americans deserve to know that as they travel around town, go to work, or take a vacation this summer, the roads, bridges, and highways are modernized and safe. Yet by the end of this month, we will no longer have sufficient funds in the Highway Trust Fund to keep our transportation projects going. This will not only mean the loss of jobs, but it will also put Americans at risk. Over the last week, the committee staff, majority and minority, have been working with our counterparts on the Senate Finance Committee to address this in a bipartisan, bicameral manner. The Senate appears to be heading down a road of a legislation that provides higher taxes for more spending, and that's not a path forward in the House. So what I put forward before the committee today is the only package with a proven history of getting big bipartisan votes in both the House and the Senate. The three provisions, pension smoothing, custom user fees, and leaking underground storage tanks, have all been used previously in bills that have received strong bipartisan votes. Pension smoothing and lust were included in the last bipartisan Highway Trust Fund legislation, which every committee Democrat voted for and was signed by President Obama. These are policies everyone at the dais is familiar with. They are policies that will provide the funding we need, and they are the only policies that will pass both the House and the Senate in time to fund the trust fund after the end of this month. So I see no reason why we can't work to get this done right away. I want to emphasize that this bill will provide us with enough funding to get through the end of May 2015. While this is not to the end of next year as I would have preferred, it is a much better approach than any proposal to just get us through the end of this year. A funding package that just goes to the end of 2014 would only create a larger crisis in December. We all know what lame duck deals look like, and more importantly, how they come together. They're not done in this room, and they're not done by members of this committee. Maybe one or two of us will be consulted, but they're often leadership deals, and the committees on the outside are on the outside looking in. Frankly, even though I've been in the room, I'm tired of Congress operating that way, and we need to get back to a more open, deliberative process, something I've tried to do. So this bill gives this committee time to deliberate and produce a longer-term solution by the end of next May. And in the meantime, I intend to have a hearing in this committee on the long-term solution for the Highway Trust Fund. I know that many Americans watching today would not place their money or confidence on Congress getting something done in time. In fact, state transportation departments have already started delaying or stopping certain highway projects to prepare for the fact that funding may fall short. Americans across the country deserve to see less gridlock on the roads and from their elected representatives. These policies are straightforward and have a history of bipartisan, bicameral support. Moving this forward will enable us to prevent the American people from going through yet another showdown and inject some stability into our state transportation systems. Additionally, today, the committee will consider two resolutions of inquiry, HRES 645 and HRES 647. The first demands copies of any emails in the possession of the Executive Office of the President that were transmitted to or from the email accounts of former IRS-exempt organizations Division Director Lois Lerner between January 2009 and April 2011. The second demands copies of Ms. Lerner's emails to or from the Department of Treasury for the same period. Any responsive documents are to be delivered to the House. A resolution of inquiry is a tool provided by the rules of the House by which documents may be requested from the executive branch. This tool, however, is no more powerful than a request for documents from a committee of jurisdiction. This fact is demonstrated by recent requests by this committee and subsequent productions of the same documents sought here. On June 13, 2014, the committee learned that Ms. Lerner's hard drive crashed, resulting in the loss of emails from January 1, 2009 to April 2011, exclusively between Ms. Lerner and persons outside of the IRS. On the following Monday, June 16, the committee requested all emails between Ms. Lerner and the Executive Office of the President and Treasury. The committee received documents in a timely manner from the White House and on June 18th and documents from Treasury on June 20th and 23rd. Because the committee has already obtained the requested documents, these resolutions aren't necessary. I'll therefore move that they be reported unfavorably out of the committee. Before I yield to the ranking member for an opening statement, I ask that all member opening statements be included in the record, and without objection, so ordered. Mr. Levin is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, not perhaps the most important part of our proceedings today because of the highway bill, but happy birthday.
Well, thank you.
And there's a unanimous agreement we will not sing.
I'm very grateful for that. Thank you.
Also,
the birthday greeting, not singing.
Right. And if I might, let me do an opening statement on the two resolutions later.
All right.
On the highway bill, and it's more than highways. In announcing this markup, Mr. Chairman, you argued that patching the Highway Trust Fund through the next May, would give this and other committees the full influence they deserve in crafting a long-term solution. Yet, in the last 3+ years, the Republican majority on this prestigious panel has failed to take advantage of its potential influence and its responsibility to sustain the Highway Trust Fund over the long term and shore up vital infrastructure projects. In fact, this committee has not held a single hearing on financing options for the Highway Trust Fund since Republicans assumed the majority of the House, despite Democrats urging otherwise. 6 months ago, every Democrat on this committee requested that you hold a series of hearings on financing options. As we wrote, time is of the essence. That request went unheeded, and we now find ourselves at the 11th hour with the Highway Trust Fund running on fumes. Unless Congress acts by the end of this month, more than 100,000 transportation projects could be delayed, and as many as 700,000 construction jobs could be put at risk. Our infrastructure, once a point of pride around this world, is literally falling apart. The American Society of Civil Engineers gave our country's roads an overall grade of D in its 2013 report card. More and more of our nation's bridges are becoming structurally unsound. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that in its current form, the Highway Trust Fund will experience a shortfall of $120 billion, $120 billion over the next 10 years. Federal inaction and short-term extensions create uncertainty at the state and local level and hinder needed transportation investments. Americans deserve better. They deserve a long-term solution from this Congress that provides certainty for states and local communities and construction workers alike, and that addresses our nation's overwhelming infrastructure needs. We must acknowledge that our nation's transportation infrastructure requires reliable and sustainable funding. Funding the trust fund through the end of this year will maintain the pressure on this Congress to reach that long-term solution. Given that the majority's legislation is using the same offsets used to pay for the bipartisan Senate-passed unemployment insurance extension, and since Speaker Boehner has demanded that any such action be attached to a jobs bill, I once again urge House Republicans to take this opportunity to extend assistance to America's job seekers. The bill before us today is a jobs bill, but the Republicans continue to refuse to act to allow a vote on the floor of the House on unemployment insurance. In the more than 6 months since Republicans first blocked an extension of unemployment insurance, more than 3 million Americans have been cut off benefits. Despite the improvement our economy continues to make, with 52 consecutive months of job growth, long-term unemployment is well above where it has been during every previous recession since the Great Depression. Without unemployment benefits, which requires claimants to actively search for work, more of the long-term unemployed will give up looking for work, causing long-term harm both to them and our economy. Mr. Chairman, we will have an amendment on the highway bill when it's in order.
Thank you. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 5021, the Highway and Transportation Funding Act of 2014. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance, along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Mr. Tom Bartold, Chief of Staff to the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Bartold, welcome to the committee, and you may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Levin, the members have before them 4 documents prepared by my colleagues, JCX 79, which describes the underlying legislation, and its green sheet making the amendment in the nature of a substitute, which is a clerical correction, JCX 82. We provided 2 different estimate tables, JCX 80, which is the revenue effects of the legislation, and since the legislation involves the Highway Trust Fund, JCX 81 provides the different trust fund effects from the transfers that are being made. By way of a brief summation of the legislation, it extends the trust fund expenditure authority through May 31st of 2015 and updates the allowable purposes. It transfers $7,765 million from the general fund to the highway subaccount of the Highway Trust Fund. It transfers $1 billion from the Leaking Underground Storage Tank Trust Fund to the Highway Trust Fund, and it transfers $2 billion from the general fund to the mass transit subaccount of the Highway Trust Fund. Then, as the chairman noted, it revises the percentages for the applicable segment rates used for determining normal cost and funding targets for qualified plans, and extends authority to collect certain custom user fees for 1 year. That concludes my summary. Happy to answer any questions the members might have.
Well, thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. Bartold? Yes, Mr. McDermott.
I noticed that we didn't make Mr. Bartold swear that he would tell the truth, but I'd like to ask a question. Is there anything in this bill that could be construed as an earmark in any shape or form?
Well, under the rules of the House, it's a determination of the chairman to determine whether there are tax earmarks, but following the general guidelines of the rules, I'm not aware of anything, sir.
In other words, there's no provisions in there that send money to Kansas City or something special to
the legislative text is merely in terms of monies. It's merely transferring funds into the Highway Trust Fund, the various accounts, and out of the trust fund account. It has no specific purpose in that. The expenditure purposes are defined by other legislation.
And if I might, Title I is not before this committee.
I'm sorry?
Title I is not before this committee. That's T&I.
Okay.
I think you're maybe
We're
thinking
just,
about T&I.
You're saying all we're doing is
funding,
giving them the money
yeah,
to the T&I committee. They
which
can
is our
do whatever
jurisdiction.
they want
Yes.
with it.
So I think that's what you're thinking about is what is the T&I committee doing, and that's not before us.
Because basically, when the money's given to the trust fund, it's then distributed, at least at present, on a formula basis to the states?
The allowable purposes are defined by other enabling legislation, and I assume that that's what's covered under Title I.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Bartold, just to clarify, this legislation is just a straight extension of MAP 21, is it not?
My colleagues and I haven't reviewed Title I. I mean, that's our understanding, but I can't.
No, the Ways and Means portion.
Oh, the funding.
The funding portion is really provides for an extension of.
Just payments into the fund, and the revenue sources are the same as map 21. That's correct, sir.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Oh, Mr. Larson.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bartold, under regular order, how long is normally a renewal of the Highway Trust Fund? How long would that be for?
The map 21 was a 2-year extension. Prior to that, it was a 5-year extension. I mean, the Congress determines the length, so I don't know that there's an automatic regular length of time, sir.
So traditionally, with respect to the Highway Trust Fund, there hasn't been a traditional 5 or 6. My understanding, for example, that it was a 6-year fund that Congress would, for the purposes of planning and for the purposes of the American workforce, specifically the people in the construction areas, and given the cyclical nature of a lot of this work, highway construction primarily, which for so many parts of the country is seasonal. What you're saying is there has been no set time, that this is something that was arbitrarily decided by the various committees of Congress?
The Congress has determined the length of time. As I noted, the most recent extension was 2 years. Prior to that, it was 5 years. So yes, in the past, there have been longer
Those were
periods.
extensions of the bill, not the full.
Well, they would be extensions which would also define the allowable expenditure purposes. The Ways and Means Committee has typically, in conjunction with T&I, for example, taken the allowable purposes and said expenditures may be from the trust fund for the purposes that are laid out by the other committee, and then that's jointly laid before for the House for its
Well, my whole
consideration.
point of trying to get my arms around this is that for going back and conducting forums back home, and with infrastructure being a number one issue, citizens ask this question all the time, and they say, why is it that Congress cannot give us a longer period of time so that we can do the planning? We want the certainty, we want the ability to hire, and what we provide them is more uncertainty and another example of kicking the can down the road and only creating further angst, further recoiling them from making any decisions about hiring, and in fact, have them looking at the potential of layoffs. We're already well gone past the construction season in New England, and our people are saying to us, the feedback I get from the road builders and from the AFL-CIO and the chamber is, please give us a long-term solution so that we can do this planning and not find ourselves right back in this situation again. And I was just wondering if, were there previous Congresses where that happened, or is this somehow some mystic notion that those road builders have, that there used to be a planning process here that you could rely on, that you knew would be funded, that allowed business and planning and commerce to flow?
Excuse me. As I noted, in the past, the Congress has determined on longer extensions. The one point I was trying to make is that there's not overriding legislation that has said that each extension should be a certain number of periods in terms of budget rules or process. It's up to the Congress to determine the planning period, the planning and funding period.
Well, it's my sincere hope, and I certainly appreciate the circumstances that our colleagues are working on the other side of the aisle, and I get the politics of it. But the American people don't get is that the necessity of improving our infrastructure and the lack of action on the part of the Congress We ought to stay here till we get the job done and at least send a message. Look, infrastructure is neither Democrat or Republican. It's American, and we ought to help the American people out. This proposal just kicks the can down the road.
All right, thank you. Time's expired. Any other questions? Oh, Mr. Pascrell.
Mr. Chairman, listening to a good friend from Connecticut, I would ask the committee, through your insights, when we, use your term, kick the can down the road, we are squeezing smaller contractors and their ability to take part in the reconstruction of America. Whether we're talking about roads, whether we're talking about bridges, I don't care what we're talking about, this effect. And secondly, those smaller contractors can't absorb a delay in payment. And you know that if we don't act, not only are we emptying the trust fund, but payments to those contractors through the states, et cetera, are delayed. Smaller contractors cannot absorb that, Mr. Chairman, cannot. So, in conclusion, I suggest that what Mr. Larson is talking about is applicable to everybody up here in the dais and in their districts. And I would ask you to think very seriously about that, because not only do we want to put people to work on jobs that have to be done because they're not going to get cheaper as if we delay them, but that in that process of thinking about it, think about those contractors who have to bid for this work, and we're asking them in delaying the process to absorb the later payments, and you do not have the continuity, you do not have the assurances that the money's going to be there when you do the work in the first place. And I think that we should be thinking about that as well. We're talking about a lot of people going to work if we do what is necessary in the infrastructure, both above ground and beneath the ground, because we're going to be talking about the same thing in doing with our sewers, with our water infrastructure. Same thing. Work needs to be done. These are investments. We saw what happened 40 years ago when we had mostly a privatized mass transit system. And there is part, I think $2 billion is transferred here because the transit trust fund seems to be pretty good at this point. It's pretty solid right now. But we saw what happened 40 years ago when most of our mass transit was privatized. And that's why it totally collapsed. And that is why Eisenhower saw this, Democrats and Republicans saw this in the past. This is something we always came together on because it was good for the country. It was an investment in our economy. And so, Mr. Chairman, I ask you, please consider those small contractors. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I have Mr. Renacci and then Mr. Neal and then, okay. Mr. Renacci.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, as you are aware, and all members really are aware on this committee, a short-term stopgap measure that Congress has become accustomed to passing really has stymied investment, job creation, and economic growth. It has bred unpredictability and really uncertainty in its place. While I reluctantly support this short-term measure before us today in order to ensure federal highway funding continues, I do so assuming that the committee will work to have a permanent solution to the Highway Trust Fund insolvency by May 31st, 2015, before funding runs dry again. I appreciate your comments and your opening statements about future hearings this year on permanent funding options, and I look forward to working with you and the rest of our colleagues on this committee in crafting a long-term solution to one of our country's most pressing problems. And I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Neal.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to pick up, if I could, on the comments of Mr. Pascrell. The two of us served as mayors of good-sized cities. And in the Northeast, you have a very short construction season. You depend mightily upon getting this money out the door at the behest of the federal government, obviously. But not to miss the point in the larger picture that Mr. Pasquale has described, it sort of goes like this. We can all lament what has happened to the regular order in Congress. The committees used to function in tandem on the highway bill. It was, as Mr. Levin and I described this morning in a walkover, the easiest piece of legislation at one time to pass in Congress. There was no partisanship. You could generally count on going north of 400 votes. You saw the package described. You had an opportunity through the Authorizing Committee, through the Appropriations Committee, and the Ways and Means Committee handle the tax side of issues, but there was a general consensus of the import of the whole notion of public infrastructure and emphasis on the term public because it's a public responsibility. And I hope as we go forward we can return to the regular order that was so important to all of us across the country. Infrastructure puts people to work quickly, creates greater efficiency, and the ease with which people move from one sector of the economy to the other is a public responsibility. I've seen the transformation over many years of the New England economy, and coupled with the fact, the other thing that I think needs to be pointed out perhaps to some of the newer members of the Ways and Means Committee in Congress, when you travel along the federal highway system in New England, one of the things that stands out that's glaring, it says the Dwight D. Eisenhower Federal Highway System. A Republican president, Sam Rayburn and Lyndon Johnson, made sure that public infrastructure was in front of the American people all of the time. And I think, again, we all ought to look back at what has happened in this stalemating process, and America has stopped thinking big on public transportation. Highways, airports, roadways, railroads, and bridges, they are in dire need of repair.
Mr. Kind.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to break ranks here a little bit and ask Mr. Barthel the question. If you could help clarify the Lust pay for in this. I believe it's $1 billion under the chairman's mark. How does that work exactly?
The Leaking Underground Storage Tank Trust Fund is funded by a separate excise tax of 0.1% per gallon on fuels. The provision in the mark merely transfers balances from the Lust Trust Fund to the Highway Trust Fund.
Are we running surpluses in that trust fund right now that would
yes.
enable us to transfer that $1 billion?
Yes.
Or is that just float money that exists in the trust fund?
No, there's, I believe the Congressional Budget Office has reported too that there's a surplus.
So there's no demand on that money right now?
Well, there are
leaking.
not on that billion, is my understanding.
Okay, and then the other two, the pension smoothing and also the customs fees, between the three, that gets us to $10.9 billion through May of next year. Is that correct?
The legislation extends the expenditure authority through the end of May of next year.
Right. And that would be roughly $10.9 billion that we're going to try to stopgap and pay for that period of time. Is that, if my math is correct?
If you look at JCX 81, where we summed up the trust fund effects, you can see that the highway subaccount of the Highway Trust Fund is receiving a little bit more than $8.7 billion, and the mass transit account $2 billion. So the total of those two would be approximately $10.7, $10.8 billion.
Okay, great. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the fact that there are no easy lifts in this place anymore, let alone for the major infrastructure modernization plan we need as a nation now. But I don't know if anyone else sees the irony of what's going on this week. I mean, tomorrow we're going to have a bill on the floor that will permanently extend the bonus depreciation at a cost of $280 billion over the next 10 years, and not a nickel of it paid for, not a nickel of it offset. And here we are scratching and clawing and crimping together a $10 billion package for 10 months for the infrastructure needs of our nation today, which is wholly inadequate. And I appreciate comments with my colleagues on the other side about the need for a 6-year bill I think we're all in agreement with it. I fail to see where the pressure points, though, lie that's going to help us get to a 6-year permanent transportation infrastructure bill that we can come to an agreement on. I don't think this decision becomes any easier next May than it is today. Certainly not going to be any easier in December if there's some plan for a lame duck session to deal with this. And it behooves this committee, since it's our jurisdiction and our responsibility, to work together here in the 113th and get this done now. And I would hope my colleagues would support the Blumenauer amendment that he's about to offer that calls on this Congress in the 113th to come up with a 6-year plan for infrastructure investment that our nation needs. Because soon we're going to find ourselves into another presidential election cycle, and you know how much fun this issue is going to be then, when the guns go off for the race to the White House, which my guess is going to be in the middle of November this year. So, I mean, realistically, we don't have much time to dither. And I certainly would be in favor of canceling the August recess and having this Congress singularly focused on this transportation 6-year bill, rather than kicking it down the road again, whether it's 6 months or 10 months from now, where we're going to find ourselves in the same exact position that we are today. This is the jobs bill. This is something that can help ignite the growth that we need in the economy and lay the foundation that will sustain long-term economic growth. And it's not happening. It's not going to happen with this $10 billion patch over the next 10 months. And what our contractors, what our DOT folks, what our laborers back home are saying is they need some predictability over the next 6 years so they can get up and get moving. And we're not giving that to them today. And I'm afraid we're not going to be able to give it to them in December or next May and when it comes time. And we still have time here with the remaining session in the 113th for us to make some tough decisions. But everyone's so goddamn afraid of making tough decisions around here, especially anything that deals with some revenue. And that really is the elephant in the room here, is how do we plug the shortfall. And this doesn't get us there. And I'm afraid we're going to be right back to the same spot, whether it's next year or the end of this year.
The gentleman mentioned the Blumenauer amendment. I'm ready to entertain amendments if there are no.
Thank you, Mr.
All right.
Chairman.
I have Mr. Thompson, then Mr. Blumenauer. And then
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to agree with my colleagues who have mentioned the importance of doing this bill now and doing it on a long-term basis. I don't think there's any way you can get around this. This is a jobs bill. This is, in fact, one thing that the Congress of the United States of America can do to influence jobs in every district across our great country. I don't think I remember a time when I've had such a wide range of supporters come to see me, and not once, not twice, probably 5 or 6 times since we've been laboring over what we're going to do on this transportation bill. The Chamber of Commerce, they know how important this is for jobs in their community, in every community across the country. Labor, they know how important this is. This bill is what puts their men and women to work, building the critical infrastructure that we need in this country. Businesses, all at the table together. Businesses know this is a make or break for them. If they don't get this funding, or they get it in dribbles and drips, and that's what this bill is doing, make no mistake about it, they can't plan for the future. They can't hire a workforce. They can't schedule the work. They can't pay their bills. And consumers as well, the everyday constituents that we represent, they know that they need transportation in their community for everything from what it does to their cars to drive over bad streets and roads to the lack of infrastructure that stops them from growing their business. The transportation bill has always been bipartisan. I used to be on the transportation committee. We used to send that thing out of the committee. The funding would come out of this committee and would sail off the floor with strong bipartisan support. And quite honestly, this may be the only thing that we can find this type of widespread support for. We're not getting it for any of the other things we seem to be spending all our time on, the IRS, Benghazi, the freeing of the soldier in Afghanistan. We've got enough of these things to be partisan on. This should not fall in that partisan rut. This should be bipartisan. We should do a long-term funding bill. It's what we're elected to do. It's what we should do. We have an opportunity here. This is one bright light in what's been a pretty dim performance over the last almost 2 years now. Don't flip that switch off. Let's make sure that we pass this bill, pass a long-term bill, put America to work, and do what our constituents have sent us here to do. I yield back.
Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to clarify one point with the conversation between Mr. Larson and Mr. Barthold about the duration of transportation bills. I think there was a slight misstatement. In the original iced tea, it was a 6-year bill. We had 1997, a 6-year bill. What followed, because of an inability to grapple with what Mr. Thompson talked about in terms of some of the funding issues, since then, we've had a 4-year bill, 21 extensions, and a 27-month kick the can down the road sort of quasi-authorization extension last time. So I just want to, you used to have 6-year bills, then we kind of stumbled to 4-year, then we had 27 months, but we have had 21 extensions since we had a real bill, I think. There wasn't a 5-year bill in there, and it wasn't a 2-year bill. In my understanding, it's 4-year, 27-month, and 21 extensions. Not that it's a big deal, but I think it's significant in terms of how we've been spinning our wheels for 11 years. Isn't that right?
Mr. Blumenauer, I will work with my colleagues after the markup, and we'll go back over the past 2 decades and report on the legislative history.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Schwartz.
Thank you. And just to follow up on some of my Democratic colleagues on who have been raising the issue of the time frame here, while this does not have a time period, we're talking only about the funding. It is true that this funding, if we were spending at the current rate, would run out at a certain point. Can you calculate when that would be? There's been some discussion on our side about this, but and I think on the Republican side too. But you could make a calculation on that as well.
Well, Ms. Schwartz, that's would actually be the responsibility of the Congressional Budget Office in terms of projecting the outlays from the
So you would have no idea
funds,
how long
but
it will last.
I do not know what their current projection of expenditure rate is, but I'm sure they'd be happy to tell the committee.
It's all right. We actually have a pretty good assessment. In fact, the chairman talked about this, so there shouldn't be any misunderstanding. This is a short-term fix, and it is a fix that will potentially take us until May. And as my colleagues have been pointing out, as much as we all agree, and we do, that we cannot let funding for transportation expire, run out of money. Our roads and bridges are in dire need of help. Our infrastructure in our states and our nation are in dire need of help. Our states are doing what they can. Local communities are doing what they can. But really big projects, big infrastructure, big roads and bridges do not get done without federal funding. And if we expect to grow this economy, we have to expect to fund our transportation infrastructure. In Pennsylvania alone, we have seen our roads and bridges. We've got actually a D- from the American Society of Civil Engineers, a D- in the condition of our roads, bridges, and public transit. We have 4,500 structurally deficient bridges in Pennsylvania. And we are going to, there's a little effort to do what we can on this, but mostly what our Department of Transportation is doing, well, they're putting some money into maintenance and just maintaining what we have. What they're doing is spending more time going around to all these bridges and putting on lower weight limits because, in fact, these bridges cannot handle the weight limits they once did. This is a dangerous situation in Pennsylvania and across this country. We know that 40% of our major roads and highways are in poor or mediocre condition. We are not going to grow our economy in Pennsylvania or in this country unless we actually fund transportation infrastructure. And while we will likely all support a temporary fix, it is really irresponsible for us not to do the work we are supposed to do, which is to fund major infrastructure and transportation projects over the long term. We should do a 6-year transportation bill. I agree with my colleagues who have said this isn't going to get any easier in the months ahead. It's not going to get necessarily easier in lame duck, but it certainly isn't suddenly going to be easier in a new session of Congress. We should pass a short-term temporary fix to make sure those funds are flowing, but we have got to get down to the business that we're expected to do, and that is to find the funding and make a commitment to the funding that's necessary to make sure that we have the roads, the bridges, the public transit, and the major infrastructure in this nation that can grow our economy. And if it is a basic obligation of this Congress to do it, and going from one temporary fix to another is not going to give the stability that's necessary to be able to move ahead in thinking not just to patch those potholes, and my God, we have potholes in Pennsylvania after this winter, but to actually do what we need to do to not only fix our roads and bridges, but to begin to think in smart ways about how to create an infrastructure that will move goods and products and grow this economy in the 21st century, and will fall behind if we don't do it. So well, many of us, and I think we will, may support a short-term fix, and I know Mr. Blumenauer is going to be offering an amendment to do it in a better way. We cannot accept mediocre behavior on the part of Congress in not taking on the major work that we should be doing, and that includes finding ongoing certainty for funding roads and bridges, highways and public transit, ports, you name it, that will grow our economy in this nation, and I yield back.
All right, Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, when I first came here in 1987, I served on the old Public Works and Transportation Committee. And we acted together in a bipartisan fashion. I think now is the time to act and not delay. I am prepared to support a short-term fix, but we must take the long, hard look. Our bridges, our roads, they're in very bad shape. In the southern parts of the United States of America, we had snow this season. I'm talking real snow. Not like you have in Michigan, but we had real snow, and we didn't know how to deal with it. So we have potholes all over the place. Our bridges are not safe. Our roads are not safe. And I think this committee should understand that our roads and bridges, we don't have Democratic bridges or Republican bridges, Republican roads or Democratic roads. Roads are roads, and we need to fix them. Make our roads and bridges safe for the American people. And we can do it. Let's have the short-term fix, but let's come back here and fix our roads and bridges. Invest in our transit system and our airports. In my district, we have 3 major interstate highways running through the heart of the city. We have the largest commercial airport in the world. That's commerce, it's jobs, safety. We can do it, and we can do it in a bipartisan fashion. Let's do it.
Mr. Becerra.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Berthold, thank you for your testimony on the bill and explaining it to us. The chairman mentioned that the bill provides resources to keep the Highway Trust Fund going for about 10 months. It takes us into about mid-year of next year. I'm looking at your chart that goes through the pay-fors, the way we find the money to pay for it in this bill. Can you tell me how much revenue will be collected during the period that the chairman said that we would be funding these transportation projects, which would take us somewhere toward the middle of next year? How much money are we collecting through the different pay-fors that are provided for the transportation fund?
Thank you, Mr. Becerra. You're referring to our revenue table, JCX 80-14. We do not break the revenue streams down quarterly. These report on fiscal year basis. May of next year is almost 3/4 of the way into the next fiscal year. If you were to simply add the 2014 fiscal year total and the entire 2015 fiscal year total, you'd be at approximately $3.5 billion.
Billion dollars.
Billion dollars,
Billion.
yes, sir.
So about $3.5 billion, something less because we're not going to go to the full end of the fiscal year. So, but
that'd be
say
correct, sir.
roughly $3.5 billion. And over that same 10-month period, we're going to lay out about how much money for transportation?
Well, as I told Ms. Schwartz, I do not have the Congressional Budget Office projections on expected outlays that would result from the authorizations in the entire legislation.
How much does this bill generate in new funding for transportation?
As noted in JCX 81, the trust fund bill, it provides funding in the highway subaccount and the mass transit subaccount that are equal to approximately $10.8 billion.
Okay, so $10.8 billion, and the estimate is that would run until the middle of next year. You just mentioned that through the middle of next year, we will actually collect under this legislation no more than $3.5 billion. And so we are essentially mortgaging in order to find the monies to pay for this. So for a 10-month funding of transportation projects, we're finding 10 years' worth of offsets. And so rather than try to pay for this as we go, to find a permanent source of funding, we are grabbing all over the shelf to find the dollars to take care of 10 months worth of transportation funding over 10 years. Let me ask you this. I'm looking at some of the pay-fors. Can you name the pay-for that's in this legislation that has anything to do with transportation? I see a pay-for that gets money from a pension account. I see a pay-for that gets money from customs fees from import-export activities. I see pay-fors that have something to do with anything but transportation. Is there a pay-for that you see in this bill that has anything to do with transportation?
I explained the source of the transfers to the fund, Mr. Becerra, and you've accurately described the pension provision and the custom user fee provision.
Okay, so you're not able to identify for me any pay-for that has anything to do with transportation. So we have a bill that has 10 months of funding and has to go 10 years out to find a way to pay for it. And the way it's paid for has nothing to do with transportation. Where in the past, as I think Mr. Blumenauer tried to make the point, we found a secure source of funding that related essentially to transportation. Whether it was a gas tax, whether it was user fees for those who use our roads and highways, we would try to make folks who use the system pay for the system. Here we got a stopgap, short-term measure that goes 10 years out to pay for 10 months of funding and has nothing to do with transportation. In the Peters that are getting the money, we're asking Pauls that have nothing to do with transportation to pay for it. Now, I think my time has expired, so I'll wait until we go into the amendments. But it disturbs me that this last-minute stopgap measure has nothing to do with transportation when it comes to its funding source. I yield back.
Mr. Bartold, the gas tax is a tax on fuel, correct?
Yes, sir, and the LUST.
And the LUST fund is a tax on fuel as well, is it not?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman.
Are there any further questions? If there are no further questions, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment.
If you would suspend while the amendment is distributed, please. Thank you.
And I was reserved a point of order, Mr. Chairman.
A point of order is reserved. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate our having this conversation today. I'd like to pick up where my friend from Ohio, Mr. Mancini, left off in terms of the need to actually do this right. But I'm afraid the decision of the Republican leadership to move forward with this funding for 9 months signals that this Congress is probably going to give up on its responsibility to deal meaningfully with our responsibility for transportation. It's ironic, Mr. Chairman, there's nobody I respect more than you, but you talked about backroom deals and waiting till the end of the year. Well, I mean, this is kind of what this is doing today. This is a backroom deal. We have written off the rest of the Congress. The committee's not been involved. And in all likelihood, we're moving forward to the next Congress that's going to have a more narrowly divided Senate, regardless of who's in charge. The heat of the next presidential election, I think it's already started. And I appreciate your saying that we're going to have a hearing. You and I have been talking about this for months. We've not had a hearing on transportation since the Republicans assumed control of this committee. If we'd had a hearing, we could have heard from leaders across the country about the need and the choices. And we could have heard from Bill Graves from the Trucking Association, a former Republican governor of Kansas, Dr. Pete Ruane, a respected leader for 3 decades of road builders, Terry O'Sullivan from the Laborers Union, Ted Adlin, a constituent of mine who used to be chair of the AGC. That we could have heard one of the most interesting odd couples in politics these days, Chamber President Tom Donahue and AFL-CIO President Rich Trumka, talking about the crying need to put people to work and spell out solutions, and you would have heard from them why it is a mistake to take the pressure off of this Congress and kick it down the road, not just to next Congress, because I'll guarantee you, next May, we're not going to be dealing with funding and a 6-year reauthorization. We're probably writing off next Congress and have to wait until a new president and hopefully a Congress that is willing to accept this challenge. I'd like to enter into the record a report from Standard & Poor's Rating Services, Economic Research, U.S. Infrastructure Investment, a chance to reap more than we sow. It is a powerful statement about the economics that are involved that a number of my colleagues have talked to. Everything from increasing economic activity beyond the actual investment to deficit reduction if we do this right. Mr. Chairman, we would have heard from a wide array of experts, and hopefully we still can this Congress, about how to make our communities safer, stronger, our families more secure with better transportation. You'd heard from AAA about how people are paying a tax of $1 a day right now for damage to their automobiles. There are many recommendations from distinguished blue ribbon committees that talk about revenue increases, and many alternatives have been discussed. It's no secret that some of our Republican colleagues favor shutting down the federal program essentially, cutting the gas tax dramatically, if not entirely, and turning the programs back to the states. I personally think it's a misguided program. I don't think it's particularly what the country needs or the country wants, but it deserves a hearing. It's a viable alternative. And there are others that just want to limp along with the Republican budget that, if somehow approved, would have no new transportation projects for the next fiscal year, a 30% reduction in funding over the next 10 years, and essentially a continuation of the do-nothing policies. My friend Congressman Kine pointed out, we've approved, I think, in the neighborhood of $600 billion of unfunded tax cuts. That's enough to fully fund 3 6-year bills, if that was a priority. These are legitimate options. Some of them are illegitimate options. But I think our committee should not be missing in action. We haven't yet done the work. We haven't heard from the experts, and we certainly are nowhere near a decision. Now, there's no reason we can't approve my amendment, which would require that Congress deal with it before we go home for the year. I personally am willing to have hearings this month. I'm happy to come back next month. I'm going to be talking about transportation from Portland, Maine to Portland, Oregon, and various places in between. I'd love to do it before this committee in August. But if it has to be after Labor Day, so be it. But let's give America a robust 6-year bill dedicated with sustainable funding, not the 21 extensions
Time has expired.
that we've had
All right.
since 2003.
Thank you. Mr. Brady.
Mr. Chairman, first I will withdraw my point of order on the amendment.
Point of order is withdrawn.
I object to the, first let me commend Congressman Blumenauer for his work on infrastructure, sincere. It's well thought out. It is lonely. I object today to this amendment. One, because the objection to a short-term extension is, in this amendment, to make it shorter-term extension. I don't think that moves us closer to a solution. Truth is, Republicans and Democrats agree on the need for a long-term solution on highway infrastructure. Every one of our communities are crying out for a long-term solution. It has been difficult to achieve consensus to do that. That's why Republicans, Democrats together have agreed reluctantly to use General Revenue Fund to fill in the gaps of the Highway Trust Fund until we can find that long-term solution. Today, we probably see why it's been difficult to reach consensus, because too many are playing the blame game. And the truth is, House Democrats have brought no solutions forward. This committee, under the chairmanship of Mr. Levin, brought no solution forward, held no hearings. There is no Democrat House bill today to solve the long-term challenges facing our trust fund. Senate Democrats and the President have brought no bill forward, have held no vote in committee, have held no vote on the floor, have brought no ideas forward with true actions. Republicans, in Chairman Camp's discussion draft, have proposed an 8-year funding solution for the Highway Trust Fund. Certainly not the full solution, but a major step forward. The pay-fors in this bill today were embraced by both Republicans and Democrats in the MAP 21 highway funding bill. So there are no substantive objections to what we are doing here today. The good news is, Chairman Camp, as indicated in his opening statement, is holding a hearing to explore long-term solutions. It will provide a tremendous opportunity for our Democratic friends to bring their bill forward for scrutiny. I noticed that not a single member of this committee has co-sponsored Mr. Blumenauer's bill, but it will provide that opportunity for this long-term discussion. In the meantime, the clock is ticking. Our contractors are worried. Our states are worried. It really is time to act and do it in a responsible way that gives us the time, hopefully, to find that solution. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Doggett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the Blumenauer amendment. You know, today, like Willie Nelson, Americans are on the road again, but they're going a little slower, and they're going with less safety, and they're probably caught between a string of 18-wheelers if they're on roads like the ones in Texas, 18-wheelers that are having difficulty themselves getting their deliveries done in a timely way to service American commerce. Today really demonstrates that, once again, the basic House Republican approach is a fear of trying. Their guiding principle is to do nothing, and when they get into a desperate situation like they have now created, to do next to nothing. And of course, they're here to ensure that no one else does anything to address the major challenges that our country faces. Our bridges literally can fall down. Our roadways crumble. Commuters waste countless hours snarled in traffic. Public transit is hobbled, but House Republicans refuse to let us consider a normal reauthorization of the federal transportation law. You know, despite the amazing advances that have been made in technology and transportation, we haven't found any bridges that can fix themselves or potholes that can fill themselves. Some may refer to them as freeways, but it takes revenue to keep them operational.
nor can we provide a decent transportation system for America doing it on a month-to-month basis. This proposal tells America we don't even know this time next year how we'll fund transportation under this bill. Our competitors in Asia are making major investments in transportation while we do next to nothing. The only thing urgent about today's predicament is the continued Republican refusal for months, indeed for years, to do anything about reauthorization of the transportation bill. And to be told this morning at the beginning of this hearing by the chairman that we're now going to have a hearing after 18 months of this Congress is truly amazing. It's a little like the Speaker appointing recently a working group on immigration because they wouldn't do any work on immigration. We don't need a hearing. We need a fully funded, normal 5-year transportation law of the type that bipartisan majorities have overwhelmingly approved in this Congress in previous decades before the current challenges that House inaction has presented.
All right. Time has expired.
I yield back.
All right. If there are no further members seeking, Mr. Davis.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think all of us agree that infrastructure maintenance and development is an absolute must for job growth, for economic security, and for the stability of people having the opportunity to work. And for that reason, I strongly support the Blumenauer Amendment. And I do so because it is a jobs bill. We often talk about the creation of jobs, need for people to work, and there's no better way to do it than to see engineers, to see flaggers, to see construction workers, to see highways being constructed, bridges being repaired and built. When you drive down the highway taking a trip, it gives you a sense of assurance when you see that the roads are being held up because people are working. And they don't need to work for just a short period of time. They need to work knowing that not only will they be able to work this week, but they're going to be working next month, that they're going to be working next year, that they're going to be able to provide for themselves and for their families. You know, it's amazing to me that we have kept people in limbo since December who were out of work, couldn't get an unemployment check, still can't get an unemployment check. And now to tell them that they can't even go to work, I mean, that is unbelievable. That is amazing. And I would hope that we can reach agreement to the point where not only do we pass a bill that creates a solid, secure transportation system, but it also helps to stabilize the economy, provide for the job growth and economic security that we need. And I would urge passage of the Blumenauer Amendment, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Schwartz is recognized.
Yeah, I just wanted to reinforce a couple things that were said, and to understand the objections to this amendment is that this would actually be a shorter time frame potentially, since we really are not defining the time frame exactly, and then in fact the other objection is that if we were to actually pass a 6-year funded bill for transportation infrastructure in the lame duck, that somehow we would not actually have a chance to have any influence or a part of that, that it might be done in a sloppy or not appropriate way. The chairman sort of suggested that. So 2 comments about that, if I may. One is that what our amendment does is to put us on task, is to get us to focus on a long-term, sustained commitment to infrastructure and roads and bridges, the highways in our nation. And so rather than just keep kicking the can down, throw a few extra dollars, find money from somewhere else, and just patch up what we're doing for a few months. We're saying let's get serious and do it. Let's also recognize that this is July. The chairman is interested in actually weighing in on this and working with the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, which is really the one that actually does the substance on this, as he's pointed out several times. Well, let's get started right now. Nothing says we have to wait until November to do that. We could get to work right now, knowing what we want to do, work in a bipartisan way, and be able to provide not only the jobs that are necessary right now, but to build the basis for economic growth in the future. That takes long-term planning. As all of us know, these roads and bridges and highways, even small projects, take some serious work and planning to do. And if we want to be serious about how we grow this economy, we've got to get serious about what the infrastructure is that's necessary in our local communities, in our states, in our nation, to accomplish that. So I would say what we're trying to do is to actually get serious about that long-term sustained commitment to economic growth in this country by saying we ought to have a sustained long-term answer in a bipartisan way that can provide that kind of stability and expectation for the private sector and the public sector at home. And I yield back.
Thank you. I think Mr. Becerra and then Mr. Levin. And I think that will conclude on the amendment.
Thank you,
Mr.
Mr. Chairman.
Becerra.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I support the Blumenauer amendment because I think it makes the point that we should stop this short-term funding of what are essentially very long-term projects. No business on Main Street, big or small, would budget or plan this way. Certainly the largest economy in the world should not plan its transportation projects this way. I know of no major road or highway or bus or rail project that runs 8, 9, 10 months. In Los Angeles, we have a number of major projects underway. Some of them are rail, subway, some are bus, some are light rail, some are road repair. Not a one of them runs only 10 months. They all run 5, 10 years. They're big projects. There's not a cement contractor that could do business if he had to project out what he'd have to buy in advance every 8 months, every 10 months for a 5 to 10 year project. You can go broke. Same with the steel manufacturer, the asphalt contractor, the steel makers, the cement mixers. You can't do business this way. And we had a chance to work together to try to find a stable, long-term way to pay for essential road and mass transit construction and repair. This is what we're left with now. And it's almost as if you're held with a ransom. Either you do this or you keep a whole bunch of Americans from going to work next month to build the roads and bridges and highways and mass transit projects that we need. I'd like to enter into the record, Mr. Chairman, the 2 letters sent by Democrats on this committee to you, Mr. Chairman, requesting that we hold hearings to discuss how we provide a stable, long-term source of funding for America's road, highway, and mass transit projects.
Without objection, so ordered.
We have a chance now to work towards coming up with that long-term solution. I believe that's the purpose of the Blumenauer Amendment, to stop kicking the can down the road, to stop essentially filling potholes when we have to build roads and bridges and highways and mass transit systems. It's time to stop filling potholes when we really have to do the big work so that our kids can be ready to lead America into the future. So I believe the hope of those of us on this side of the aisle is that rather than do these last-minute stopgap measures that simply kick the can down the road, that we'll come up with a real solution that at the end of the day keeps so many Americans working and getting decent pay, helping build America. So with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Levin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just briefly to Mr. Brady, your comment. In 2009, in April, the Select Revenue Subcommittee held a hearing on long-term financing, and Mr. Rangel was chair. In May of 2010, when I was chair, the Select Committee held a hearing on infrastructure banks. But let me just kind of summarize what this is all about. It was said earlier that we're making the short shorter. That's precisely what we're doing. We're making the short shorter to make it long. And the only way it's going to be long is if the short becomes shorter. This amendment strikes June 1, 2015, and inserts January 1, 2015. To really put the pressure on this institution to act. I think the June 2015 date is a mirage. It's a complete mirage. It will be in the middle of a presidential election. And if anybody thinks we can delay now and hope for 2015, I think that's delusionary. This is a call to action. It's a call to action. And we should heed that call. And we should not only hold a hearing, the hearing should be held at long last as a prelude to a commitment by this committee that it will report a bill out for action on the floor of the House of Representatives and try to obtain a similar commitment on the Senate side. So I strongly urge support for the Blumenauer amendment.
All right. As no further members seek recognition, the question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Mr. Blumenauer. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No. Roll
Opinion
call.
of the chair, the noes have it.
Roll call, please.
A roll call is demanded. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson?
No.
Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Brady?
No.
Mr. Brady, no. Mr. Ryan?
No.
Mr. Ryan, no. Mr. Nunez? Mr. Nunez, no. Mr. Teaberry? No. Mr. Teaberry, no. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, no. Mr. Bustani? No. Mr. Bustani, no. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, no. Mr. Gerlach? No. Mr. Gerlach, no. Mr. Price? No. Mr. Price, no. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Smith? Mr. Schock? No. Mr. Schock, no. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, no. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, no. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, no. Ms. Black? Ms. Black, no. Mr. Reed? No. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Young? No. Mr. Young, no. Mr. Kelly? No. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Griffin? Mr. Griffin, no. Mr. Renacci? No. Mr. Renacci, no. Mr. Levin? No. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Rangel? Mr. Rangel, aye. Mr. McDermott? Aye. Mr. McDermott, aye. Mr. Lewis? Aye. Mr. Lewis, aye. Mr. Neal? Aye. Mr. Neal, aye. Mr. Becerra? Aye. Mr. Becerra, aye. Mr. Doggett? Aye. Mr. Doggett, aye. Mr. Thompson? Aye. Mr. Thompson, aye. Mr. Larson? Aye. Mr. Larson, aye. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, aye. Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, aye. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell, yes. Mr. Crowley? Mr. Crowley, aye. Ms. Schwartz? Ms. Schwartz, aye. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, aye. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, aye. Mr. Buchanan? No. Mr. Buchanan, no. Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith, no. Chairman Camp? Chairman Camp, no.
The clerk will report the vote.
16 ayes, 23 noes.
There being 16 ayes and 23 noes, the amendment is not agreed to. Are there any additional amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no further amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 5021 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. H.R. 5021 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views. So ordered. The committee will now proceed to the resolutions of inquiry. Without objection, I ask unanimous consent to submit into the record the June 18 response from the White House to the committee's request for Lois Lerner emails and the June 20 and June 23rd responses from the Department of the Treasury to the same. Mr. Levin is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think you gave your opening statement, and I'll give mine briefly. We appreciate that my Republican colleagues on the committee are prepared to vote against moving forward on these resolutions for the obvious reason that the requested information has already been provided. It is unfortunate that others in the Republican conference, in this case Congressman Steve Stockman, appear unwilling to acknowledge that. Congressman Stockman's resolutions were introduced June 25 after the White House and the Treasury Department provided all of the communications to and from Lois Lerner between 2009 and 2011. From the beginning of this investigation, there has been rhetoric and accusations from Republicans that are not supported by evidence. They are repeated by others in their conference without any acknowledgement of the facts. Notably, there was not a single email communication to or from Ms. Lerner in the White House. I hope today's message is adequately conveyed to Congressman Stockman and other congressional Republicans, and that further taxpayer dollars are not wasted in pursuit of information that has already been provided. I yield back.
Thank you. We will first consider HRES 645, requesting that the President transmit to the House any Lois Lerner emails between January 2009 and April 2011 in the possession of the Executive Office of the President. The resolution was distributed in advance and without objection will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Are there any amendments to HRES 645? If there are no amendments, I will now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee unfavorably report HRES 645 to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. HRES 645 is ordered unfavorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the resolution, and without objection, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views. So ordered. We will next consider HRES 647, requesting that the Secretary of the Treasury transmit to the House any Lois Lerner emails between January 2009 and April 2011 in the possession of the Treasury Department. The resolution was distributed in advance and without objection will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Are there any amendments to HRES 647? If there are no amendments, I will now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee unfavorably report HRES 647 to the House of Representatives.
The question is on unfavorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. HRES 647 is ordered unfavorably reported to the House of Representatives, and without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the resolution. Without objection, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views. So ordered. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned.